It was one of those mornings in St. Mary Mead when the village seemed wrapped in a kind of polite stillness, the sort that precedes gossip rather than storms. The sun was already spilling across the cobbled lanes, catching the dew upon garden hedges and the brass handles of shop doors. The clock above the butcher's had struck 9, and, as was custom, the bell outside the post office ought to have rung by now. 3 light pulls to signal that Miss Penelope Cratchit, the postmistress, had unlocked the door, but on this morning it did not. By 9:30, a small congregation had gathered outside the post office. Mrs. Hartwell in her pink hat from the fete last summer, old Mr. Chitterton tapping his cane impatiently, and young Lydia Crane, whose fiancé was abroad, and whose morning letters were her only solace. They exchanged puzzled glances, mild remarks, and, inevitably, suspicions. "Perhaps she overslept," said Mrs. Hartwell in the tone of one who could not imagine such a moral lapse. "Or perhaps," added Mr. Chitterton with relish, "she's taken ill. I heard her coughing only yesterday." It was Lydia who finally tried the handle. It would not budge. Through the glass, the interior of the post office was dimly visible, neat, ordinary, everything in its place. A stack of envelopes sat upon the counter beside Miss Cratchit's ever-present cup of tea, the spoon still resting inside. Only one thing seemed amiss. The back curtain, which usually hung half open, was drawn tightly shut. By 10, Sergeant Dodd had been sent for, and by 11, the door was broken open. The air inside was cool, faintly perfumed by the scent of lavender and ink. Behind the counter, everything remained immaculate, save for the overturned chair and the missing keys from the drawer. Miss Cratchit herself was not there. At the far end, the small door leading to her private quarters stood ajar, and it was there, in that narrow passage smelling faintly of old paper and polish, that they found her. Lying upon the floor in her dressing gown, eyes closed, one hand outstretched toward the telephone. The receiver hung just above her fingers, as though she had meant to call for help, but hadn't quite managed. "She must have fallen," murmured Sergeant Dodd. "Heart failure, perhaps." But Lydia, white as her gloves, pointed softly toward the table by the wall. There lay an open envelope, its contents missing, and beside it, a small brass key that certainly did not belong to the post office. From across the lane, at her window framed with geraniums, Miss Jane Marple watched the commotion with quiet, unhurried eyes. She noted how Sergeant Dodd failed to ask about the missing keys, how Mrs. Hartwell's tone quivered with more curiosity than sorrow, and how Lydia Crane's gaze lingered. Not on the body, but on the empty spot where the letters usually lay. Miss Marple sighed gently and set down her embroidery. "I suppose," she murmured, "it's about time I fetched my hat." By the time Miss Marple reached the post office, a mild crowd had gathered in the lane, murmuring in tones of equal parts grief and fascination. The village had always found its comfort in small curiosities. Lost cats, misdelivered parcels, or Mrs. Hartwell's latest scandal about the grocer's assistant. But a death, and such a peculiar one, was something quite beyond their usual fare. Miss Marple, in her soft grey coat and sensible hat, slipped quietly between them, offering nods of sympathy that required no words. She had the gift of making herself both visible and invisible, noticed but never regarded as a disturbance. Inside, Sergeant Dodd was dictating notes to Constable Price, his manner brisk but uncertain. He looked up, mildly flustered, when he saw her. "Good morning, Miss Marple. I suppose you've heard." "One can hardly avoid hearing in St. Mary Mead," she replied kindly. Poor Miss Cratchit. She was such a steady woman, reliable to a fault. Her eyes drifted, almost absently, over the room, the overturned chair, the cup of tea grown cold, the faint scratch on the counter where a key had been hastily turned. "Heart failure, I imagine," said the sergeant. "The doctor's on his way. Nothing else seems amiss." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "No, of course not. Except perhaps for the keys." "The keys?" "Yes," she said. lowering her gaze as though thinking aloud. "The post office is always locked with 2 keys, the outer for the door, and the inner for the till. I've often seen her lock up at precisely 6 o'clock. Such precision suggests habit, and habits, Sergeant, are rarely abandoned voluntarily." Sergeant Dodd frowned, then opened the till drawer. It was locked tight. He tried the cabinet beneath the counter, also locked. "We haven't found them," he admitted. "Perhaps they fell somewhere." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said softly. Her tone carried neither insistence nor doubt, merely observation. She moved toward the small sitting room where Miss Cratchit's body lay. The curtains were drawn here as well, but one edge had been caught between the window frame, letting in a narrow beam of autumn light. Dust floated through it like fine threads of time. Miss Marple's eyes settled on the table beside the fallen telephone. A small dish with coins, change for customers, stood neatly filled. Nearby, the opened envelope that Lydia had mentioned earlier lay empty. Only a faint mark of sealing wax clung to its edge, suggesting something official. She bent slightly, peering closer, her voice almost inaudible. "An official letter opened in private after closing hours," she murmured. "How curious." Sergeant Dodd followed her gaze. "A letter from the council, maybe. Could be about her pension." "Possibly," she said, still thoughtful. "Though I rather think not. The ink mark here is from the Treasury. See the faint blue border. She must have handled it very recently." Before the sergeant could reply, footsteps approached. It was Dr. Hayward, his black bag in hand, spectacles glinting. He knelt beside the body with quiet efficiency, examining the hands, the lips, the position. After a moment, he straightened and looked uneasy. "Well?" asked Dodd. "Not a heart failure," said the doctor gravely. "No signs of natural collapse. Her pulse must have stopped abruptly. Look here, under the nails. And the tongue?" He hesitated, glancing toward Miss Marple. "Poison," she said gently. Hayward nodded. "Most likely." A silence fell, heavy and complete. Outside, the clock struck 11, and a flock of birds rose suddenly from the churchyard trees. Miss Marple folded her hands neatly before her. "I expect," she said in her mildest tone, "that poor Miss Cratchit received something in that envelope she was never meant to read, or perhaps something she was never meant to keep." Sergeant Dodd stared at her. "You think it's murder?" Miss Marple's expression did not change. "Oh, my dear Sergeant," she replied softly. "In St. Mary Mead, everything is murder until proven otherwise." She turned toward the window, her reflection faintly visible in the glass. Beyond it, she could see Lydia Crane lingering at the gate, pale and trembling, speaking hurriedly to Mrs. Hartwell. Lydia's eyes kept flickering toward the postmistress's quarters, as though something there frightened her. Miss Marple watched for a long moment, then said quietly, almost to herself, "It seems to me that Lydia knows precisely what was in that letter." And with that, she reached for her gloves and stepped back into the morning light, where the village already buzzed with new theories, none of which were quite close to the truth. By the time Miss Marple reached the churchyard path, the murmurs behind her had already begun to swell into a chorus of speculation. It was remarkable, really, how swiftly a tragedy in St. Mary Mead could turn into a social event. Mrs. Hartwell, with her air of authority borrowed from decades of nosiness, was already telling anyone who would listen that the postmistress had been terribly overworked and not quite herself these past weeks. Lydia Crane, still pale, stood a little apart, twisting a handkerchief between her fingers and saying nothing at all. Miss Marple paused by the low wall that bordered the post office garden, pretending to admire the roses. She was not, in truth, looking at the flowers, but at Lydia, at the way the girl's eyes darted every few seconds toward the upper window of Miss Cratchit's flat. Fear was a revealing emotion, Miss Marple knew, and Lydia was afraid of something more than the body inside. Presently, The girl seemed to feel the weight of Miss Marple's gentle gaze and approached with hesitant steps. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Isn't it dreadful?" "Poor Miss Cratchit. She was always so kind to me, always remembered to ask after William's letters." "Yes, my dear," Miss Marple replied softly. "A most reliable woman. She remembered everyone's letters." There was a pause, long enough for Lydia to look down, long enough for guilt to stir beneath her voice. I came early this morning," Lydia said suddenly. "I wanted to send something to William before the post went out, but the door was still locked. I thought perhaps she'd gone out, though it wasn't like her." "You didn't see her at all, then?" Lydia hesitated. "No, only the curtain drawn. And that, oh," she faltered, glancing over her shoulder. There was a sound, like someone moving about, but then it stopped. Miss Marple nodded, her expression sympathetic. Sometimes houses remember their inhabitants longer than they should. Strange little echoes. Lydia managed a nervous smile, but her relief was thin. Miss Marple watched her walk away toward the green, where a few villagers stood waiting to ask questions she wouldn't answer. Then she turned back toward the post office, her mind quietly knitting together the threads that others dismissed as coincidence. Inside, Sergeant Dodd was locking up for the day. The body had been taken away, and a constable posted at the door. Miss Marple slipped in under the pretext of retrieving her umbrella, which she had not in fact left behind. Dodd was kneeling by the counter, writing down an inventory of the drawers. "Nothing missing," he muttered. "No sign of robbery, no struggle. If this was murder, it's the strangest I've seen." "People rarely kill for the obvious reasons," said Miss Marple gently. "Sometimes it's for something that looks like nothing at all." She leaned on the counter, her eyes tracing the faint pattern of tea stains on the saucer, the indentation left by a pen, the ghost of routine interrupted mid-motion. Something had happened here between one ordinary moment and the next. She could almost feel it. Her eyes wandered to the mailbag in the corner. It was half empty, letters sorted neatly into piles, one stack marked "Outward." Miss Marple reached toward it with a small apology. "You don't mind if I tidy them a bit, do you, Sergeant? I dislike seeing things unfinished." Dodd gave a weary sigh, but nodded. She sifted through the envelopes delicately, her fingers pausing on one addressed to the Reverend George Arbuthnot, St. Agnes Vicarage. The seal bore the same faint blue border she had noticed on the opened envelope in Miss Cratchit's sitting room. Treasury paper, official correspondence. But what business had the vicar with the Treasury? She replaced it carefully and smiled to herself, a soft, almost wistful smile that meant her mind was already 3 steps ahead. "I suppose," she said conversationally, "Miss Cratchit was the sort of woman who kept everyone's confidences, wasn't she?" Dodd nodded. "Yes, ma'am. Quiet sort. Never one for gossip." "Quite," murmured Miss Marple. "And yet it is the quiet ones who see everything, and are seen by no one. A most dangerous combination." As she walked back into the crisp afternoon, the church bell began to toll for noon. The village appeared unchanged, the children chasing hoops, the baker sweeping his doorstep, the world going about its ordinary business. But Miss Marple knew better. Beneath the calm surface of St. Mary Mead, something small and poisonous had stirred, something that had crept into a locked room and turned a cup of morning tea into death. And as she passed the vicarage gate, she noticed that the blinds in the study were drawn, though Reverend Arbuthnot was almost never indoors at that hour. She slowed, thoughtful. People forgot the smallest details when they lied, and in Miss Marple's long life, it was always the smallest details that led to the truth. Miss Marple's steps slowed as she reached the vicarage gate. The gravel path was scattered with the faint traces of boot marks, too large for the Reverend's narrow shoes, and fresher than morning dew should have allowed. She paused, studying them with quiet attention, before continuing up the path. The blinds of the study window remained drawn, though she could hear movement within. A soft hum, the clink of a cup against a saucer, and the creak of a chair shifting on polished wood. Reverend Arbuthnot opened the door himself. He was a tall, kindly-looking man with thinning hair and a habit of speaking as though addressing an invisible congregation. "Miss Marple," he exclaimed, forcing a smile that was both surprised and wary. "What a pleasure, though I fear you've caught me in something of a muddle. Dreadful business at the post office, isn't it?" "Quite dreadful," she agreed softly. "I was just passing and thought to ask whether poor Miss Cratchit had perhaps delivered a letter here recently. It seems one may have gone astray." The Reverend's expression faltered just slightly before he recovered it. "A letter? Why, yes, indeed, there was something yesterday. A small envelope from the Treasury, if I'm not mistaken. Quite official-looking. I had it on my desk, but—" His eyes flickered toward the study where papers lay scattered. "Goodness, I must have misplaced it." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Oh, I'm sure it will turn up. Things usually do when one stops looking." Her gaze lingered on a faint blue mark on his right cuff, a smudge of the same wax she had seen on Miss Cratchit's table. The Reverend, noticing her glance, tucked his hands quickly behind him. "Terrible, isn't it?" he went on hurriedly. "Penelope was such a good woman, always punctual. The village will miss her dreadfully." "Yes," Miss Marple murmured. "I imagine she'll be missed most by those who had something to lose." He blinked, uncertain, and she offered a polite nod before turning back toward the path. Once she was beyond the gate, her expression softened into thought. She had seen that look before, men whose piety was shadowed by worry. And though the Reverend spoke of duty and grief, his hands had trembled, not with sorrow, but fear. At the lane's end, she met Dr. Hayward locking his surgery door. He greeted her with a faint grimace. "I've just spoken with the coroner," he said quietly. "He'll confirm poison. Likely cyanide, given the signs. Quick, efficient, quite deliberate." "Cyanide," Miss Marple repeated, almost absently. "How very purposeful. Not something one finds easily in a country village." Hayward nodded. "Precisely. The only source I can think of is the chemist's, or perhaps the gardener's shed, though neither would fit our postmistress. She wasn't the type to meddle with such things." "No," said Miss Marple softly. "But perhaps someone close to her was." They walked a few steps together in silence. The afternoon light had softened, tinting the cottages gold. Miss Marple glanced toward the green, where Lydia Crane now sat alone on a bench, the same handkerchief still twisting in her hands. "I rather think," she said, "it's time I had a word with Miss Crane." Lydia looked up as Miss Marple approached, her eyes wide and uncertain. "Oh, Miss Marple, I didn't think you'd come back." "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, sitting beside her. "One always comes back to the beginning of a puzzle, don't you find? It's where the truth first trembles." Lydia looked down at her hands. "I don't understand any of it," she whispered. "Miss Cratchit was good to me. She never hurt anyone." "No, she didn't," Miss Marple agreed. "But I think she knew something that hurt someone else." "Tell me, my dear, did she ever mention the Reverend to you?" Lydia hesitated, then nodded. "Only once. She said he'd asked her to keep something for him, a letter he wasn't ready to send yet. She said it was important, confidential." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed faintly, though her expression remained mild. "And did she tell you where she kept it?" "In her private drawer," Lydia whispered. "The one behind the counter. She always kept the key in her apron pocket." Miss Marple looked out toward the church spire, where a single crow had landed, black against the late light. "Thank you, my dear," she said softly. "You've been most helpful." As she rose, the first chill of evening brushed the air. Somewhere beyond the green, the post office bell gave a faint metallic ring, a sound no hand had touched since morning. Miss Marple paused, glancing back once. "It seems," she murmured, half to herself, "that the dead are beginning to speak." As twilight settled over St. Mary Mead, The village seemed wrapped in an uneasy stillness. The usual chatter outside the grocer's had died down, the tea shop had closed early, and even the sparrows on the green seemed subdued, as though the air itself had learned to whisper. Miss Marple walked home with her basket over her arm, pausing briefly at her gate to look back toward the post office. The constable still stood there, shifting from one foot to the other, his silhouette sharp against the dim glow of the gas lamp. The bell above the door, that familiar chime of daily life, hung motionless. Inside her sitting room, the clock ticked softly. Miss Marple set her basket aside, poured a modest cup of tea, and sat by the window. Her eyes, though gentle and kind, were far away, turning over the fragments of the day as though they were pieces of fine embroidery, searching for the thread that bound them. There was the unopened drawer, the missing keys, the blue treasury wax, the reverend's smudged cuff, and the young woman's trembling silence. None of it yet formed a picture, but instinct told her that it soon would. She was halfway through her tea when there came a knock at the door. Sergeant Dodd stood outside, looking a little more harassed than usual. "Evening, Miss Marple. Sorry to bother you at this hour." "Not at all, Sergeant. You look as though you've been wrestling with something more stubborn than a confession." He managed a tired smile. "You could say that. The coroner confirmed poison, cyanide, as the doctor said. But here's the trouble. We've no idea how she came by it. Nothing in her kitchen, nothing in her cupboards, and, well, there's another thing." He hesitated, lowering his voice. "The letter you mentioned earlier, the one from the Treasury, it's gone." "Gone?" Miss Marple repeated mildly, though her heart gave a quiet stir. "Yes, we've searched the place twice. It's vanished, along with the drawer key. The vicar swears he never saw it again after yesterday, and Lydia Crane says she knows nothing about it, but someone took it, that much is certain." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "People are very careless with the truth, Sergeant. They often hide it as if it were something embarrassing, like a moth hole in a favorite coat." Dodd looked puzzled. "Meaning?" "Meaning," she said with a faint smile, "that lies are most interesting not in their existence, but in their convenience." He frowned, but said nothing more. After he left, Miss Marple remained seated, her mind quietly alive. A missing letter from the Treasury, a vicar who lied about misplacing it, and a postmistress who died for knowing too much. It was all rather neat. Too neat. And neatness, Miss Marple thought, was not a trait of real life, but of human design. The next morning brought a damp chill and a faint drizzle that slicked the cobblestones. Miss Marple rose early, wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, and made her way to the vicarage once more, under the pretext of delivering a jar of her rose-hip jam. Reverend Arbuthnot received her in the study, though this time the blinds were open and his demeanor notably cooler. Papers had been cleared from the desk, and the faint blue wax that had stained his cuff the previous afternoon was now gone. "Such dreadful weather," she said cheerfully, setting the jar down, "and after such dreadful news. I do hope you're bearing up, Reverend. You were quite fond of Miss Cratchit, I imagine." He nodded stiffly. Yes, of course. A fine Christian woman." "She was indeed," Miss Marple agreed, her gaze wandering over the desk. "So organized. I imagine she'd have made an excellent church secretary, had she wished. Always careful with her records. Quite impossible for her to lose something, I should think." Something flickered in his expression, a tiny tremor that might have passed unnoticed by anyone else. "You'd be surprised how people misplace things, Miss Marple," he said shortly. "Oh, indeed I would," she replied softly, "though I do think it's rare for people to misplace something they never intended to keep." She left him then, smiling kindly, but the moment she reached the gate, the calm in her eyes sharpened into purpose. The drizzle had turned to mist, curling low across the green. Lydia Crane stood under the elm, her coat unbuttoned, her face pale. "Miss Crane," Miss Marple called gently. The girl startled. "A word, if you don't mind." Lydia hesitated, glancing back toward the vicarage, then nodded and approached. "My dear, I won't keep you long," Miss Marple said kindly. "But there's something you might help me understand. When you saw Miss Cratchit yesterday morning, did you notice whether the little brass key she kept for her drawer was missing?" Lydia blinked. I don't remember seeing it. She usually wore it on a ribbon round her neck, but yesterday, yes, now that I think of it, it wasn't there." Miss Marple's voice was gentle, but her eyes held the firmness of truth unspoken. "That's very helpful, my dear. You see, someone must have taken that key before she died. Someone who knew what it opened." Lydia swallowed, her gaze flickering again toward the church. "You don't think the Reverend—" "I think," Miss Marple interrupted softly, "that goodness, when mixed with desperation, can produce the most unchristian acts imaginable." She left the girl standing there, trembling in the mist, and made her way back home. The bell from the post office still hadn't rung that morning, but as Miss Marple closed her gate behind her, she thought she heard the faint click of a key turning in a lock, somewhere far off, as though the village itself had just whispered another secret into the fog. That faint click lingered in Miss Marple's mind long after she had settled back in her sitting room. Outside, the mist clung to the hedgerows, softening the outlines of the cottages until they looked almost unreal, as if St. Mary Mead were holding its breath. She stirred her tea slowly, the teaspoon moving in careful, thoughtful circles. Somewhere out there, someone was trying to tidy away the last loose thread of a story they believed finished. But Miss Marple knew better. Life, she often said, never truly ended in neat little parcels. It always frayed at the edges, and it was in those frays that the truth hid itself. By late afternoon, Sergeant Dodd appeared again, his boots muddy from the lane and his brow creased with fatigue. "We've made a bit of progress," he announced, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Traced the poison back to the chemist, signed for under the name of Mr. W. Crane. Said it was for dealing with moles in the garden." Miss Marple raised her eyebrows slightly. "Mr. Crane? But he's in India, isn't he? With the army?" "That's just it," Dodd said grimly. "His wife bought it, claimed she was acting on his behalf, said she needed it before the rain came." "How odd," murmured Miss Marple. "I don't believe the Cranes have ever had a garden problem larger than daisies. And Lydia," she added softly, "strikes me as the kind of girl who couldn't bear to kill even a slug." Dodd shifted uneasily. "It's not looking good for her, Miss Marple. The chemist identified her, and she was the first to find the body." Miss Marple's voice was calm but edged with quiet insistence. "People who find bodies rarely create them, Sergeant. They're usually the ones who care too much, or know too little." She leaned forward slightly. "Tell me, did you find the missing drawer key?" He shook his head. "No, but the vicar's housemaid swears she saw him burning papers in the hearth early this morning. Said it smelled chemical, or whatever that means. I don't want to start rumors about a man of the cloth, but—" "Rumors don't start themselves," Miss Marple said gently. "They're planted, like seeds." When he left, she sat in stillness for a long while, her fingers lightly touching the armrest, her mind weaving together what others saw as scattered coincidences. The Reverend's unease, the Treasury letter, Lydia's trembling fear, and the little brass key that no one could seem to find. All of them circled around one thing: money. Miss Cratchit, discreet and loyal, had known something she was not meant to know, something that made her a danger to someone who depended on appearances. Evening came early, heavy and low. Miss Marple wrapped herself in a shawl and went out once more, following the path toward the church. A light still burned in the vicarage study, a pale square against the deepening dusk. She moved quietly along the garden wall until she reached the open side window. Voices drifted out. Reverend Arbuthnot's, sharp with agitation, and Lydia's, thin and shaking. "I didn't mean to," Lydia cried softly. "I only wanted to frighten her. Make her give it back. You said it would just make her ill, not—" "Hush," the Reverend's voice cracked like a whip. "Do you want the whole village to hear? She was going to ruin everything. The letter was never meant for her eyes. Do you understand?" "Never." Miss Marple stepped back into the shadows, her heart steady though her pulse quickened. The faint clink of metal followed, the sound of a small key landing on the desk. "She kept this," Lydia whispered. "I couldn't destroy it. I thought you'd know what to do." Miss Marple turned silently, her steps light upon the path. The mist had deepened now, swallowing sound. She walked until she reached the end of the lane where the gaslight flickered faintly. Only then did she allow herself a quiet sigh, not of triumph, but of sorrow. By morning, she would visit Sergeant Dodd once more, and by then she would have the full story ready, every motive, every misstep, every small human weakness folded neatly into the shape of truth. For now, she let the night hold its secret a few hours longer. After all, in St. Mary Mead, justice moved best when approached with patience, politeness, and a pot of tea at the ready. The following morning dawned clear and brittle, as if the rain and fog of the night before had scrubbed St. Mary Mead of its pretense of calm. The village woke early, eager for the latest whispers. Word had already spread that Sergeant Dodd had taken Lydia Crane in for questioning, and though half the townsfolk pitied her, the other half seemed quietly thrilled. Miss Marple, however, made no haste to join the speculation. She preferred to let the noise of gossip clear the air. Truth, she always said, came best when the chatter had tired itself out. She sat by her window, knitting with an air of mild absorption, though her thoughts were far from the rhythm of her needles. The image of the Reverend and Lydia in that shadowed study replayed itself, sharp and unmistakable. Guilt could take many forms, but there was a certain cadence to panic, the way it silenced reason and tangled lies, until even the guilty forgot where their truth began. Lydia had spoken with fear, but not cunning. The Reverend's voice, on the other hand, had carried the strain of a man whose life was built upon something brittle and breaking. When Sergeant Dodd appeared before noon, his expression confirmed as much. "We've got the girl to admit it, more or less," he said, standing awkwardly in her doorway. "She claims it was all her doing, that she mixed the poison into Miss Cratchit's tea to recover that letter. Says she only meant to frighten her, not to kill her." Miss Marple looked up mildly. "Does she, indeed? And do you believe her?" He hesitated. "I'd like to, but her story doesn't quite hold. She says she was alone, but the chemist swears she didn't buy the poison until the evening before last. That would mean she had to slip into the post office sometime after hours. The door was locked, no signs of a break-in. We've no idea how she got inside." Miss Marple's eyes flickered, just once, toward the garden beyond her window where the morning light lay thin across the hedges. "I wonder," she said softly, "if she didn't go in at all." The sergeant blinked. "Come again?" "She's a frightened girl, Sergeant, not a calculating one. I imagine she carried the poison in good faith, perhaps even under instruction, believing she was doing something entirely different, perhaps preparing a tonic or cleaning fluid. No, I think the hand that placed the poison was not hers at all." Dodd frowned, confused. "Then whose?" But Miss Marple merely smiled, the sort of faint, knowing smile that always seemed to annoy and reassure in equal measure. "Let's have another look at the post office, shall we? I dare say the dead have left us something the living overlooked." They walked down the lane together, the hush of midday settling around them. Inside the post office, the scent of lavender polish still lingered. Miss Marple moved carefully through the space, her gaze taking in every small domestic order, the perfectly aligned books of accounts, the tidy drawers, the neat shelf where Miss Cratchit kept her teacups. Her eyes paused on the counter where a faint discoloration marred the wood near the kettle stand. "You see her, Sergeant? A ring from a hot cup. fresh, not yet stained into the grain. She must have made tea not long before she died. And here, a second ring, smaller, lighter. 2 cups. Dodd leaned in, following her gaze. You mean she wasn't alone? Precisely. And look, only 1 spoon, still on the saucer. Whoever drank the other cup took theirs away, perhaps when she fell. You might check the Reverend's kitchen cupboard if you'd be so kind. I expect you'll find 1 mismatched cup that doesn't belong. The sergeant's mouth twitched in disbelief, but he scribbled a note all the same. Miss Marple's eyes wandered next to the little table near the window where the opened envelope had been found. The light now fell across it in a way that revealed something faintly glinting in the fibers. A trace of wax, yes, but also a single hair, pale and fine. She plucked it gently between 2 fingers. Grey, she murmured. And quite long. Miss Cratchit's was chestnut, if I recall, but there is one head in the parish that matches this shade perfectly. Good heavens, breathed Dodd. You don't mean— Patience, Sergeant, Miss Marple interrupted kindly. We mustn't accuse until we're quite certain. But I should very much like you to ask the Reverend what became of that letter, and perhaps look over his accounts from the church fund. It may surprise you how far charity can stretch when handled by clever fingers. By the time she left the post office, the clouds had gathered again, heavy and still. She turned up the path toward the vicarage, her steps unhurried but sure. It was time, she thought, for Reverend Arbuthnot to learn that even the smallest of villages has its own quiet instruments of judgment, and that one of them, armed with nothing more dangerous than knitting needles and patience, was already at his door. The vicarage door opened before Miss Marple had the chance to knock. Reverend Arbuthnot stood framed in the doorway, his composure neat as ever, though his eyes held that unmistakable flicker of sleeplessness. Miss Marple, he said, with an effort at warmth that didn't quite reach his tone. You do get about early. Have you come regarding the funeral arrangements? I thought perhaps— She smiled faintly. Not at all, Reverend, though I dare say there'll be time enough for that later. No, I came about something rather more practical. Sergeant Dodd and I have been going through the post office again. He'll be along to see you shortly. The Reverend's hand froze on the edge of the door. To see me? Whatever for? Oh, just a few formalities, Miss Marple said lightly. You see, there's been some confusion about that Treasury letter. Odd how such things vanish, isn't it? But they often have a way of reappearing once one knows where to look. The Reverend's throat moved, a small, dry swallow. I told Sergeant Dodd all I could. It was mislaid, that's all. Ah, yes, she said pleasantly. Mislaid. It's such a gentle word for things that change hands. He stared at her, colour rising faintly in his cheeks. Miss Marple, I don't appreciate— But she interrupted him with a softness that felt almost like sympathy. You were seen burning papers in your hearth early yesterday morning. Your housemaid is quite attentive, Reverend. She thought it her Christian duty to mention it. His mouth opened, then closed again. Behind him, the mantel clock ticked sharply, filling the silence. Of course, Miss Marple went on. No one blames a man for tidying his desk. Clerical work does pile up, but I wonder if I might just step inside for a moment. Only to rest my knees, you know. He hesitated, then stepped aside stiffly. The air in the study was faintly perfumed with smoke and polish. The curtains were drawn just enough to let in a grey light that seemed to cling to every surface. On the desk sat a neat stack of correspondence, tied with ribbon. But it was the shelf above that caught Miss Marple's eye. A single mismatched cup among a row of plain white ones. Such a pretty cup, she murmured, moving closer. The pattern. Blue cornflowers, isn't it? One doesn't often see such designs now. I remember poor Miss Cratchit had a set just like it. Lovely for afternoon tea. The Reverend's hand darted toward the shelf. That? Oh, Lydia must have brought it. She's been helping about the house lately. How thoughtful of her, Miss Marple said mildly. though I can't quite imagine her in the habit of carrying crockery about. No, I think this one travelled here another way, perhaps on a kind invitation to share a cup of tea. He turned abruptly toward the window, the movement stiff and desperate. You have a cruel imagination, Miss Marple. The girl confessed, didn't she? She poisoned that poor woman out of jealousy and fear. What more do you want? She regarded him gently, knitting her fingers together. The truth, Reverend. Not the kind whispered to frightened girls, but the sort that sits heavy on the soul. You see, Miss Cratchit found out about the missing funds, didn't she? The letter from the Treasury wasn't meant for your eyes. It was meant for London, to confirm an audit. She realized too late what it implied. You asked her to return it, perhaps promised to explain, but she refused. His face had gone quite pale. The ticking of the clock grew louder, measuring each moment. Miss Marple's voice remained low, steady, and almost sorrowful. You poured her tea. Perhaps you even prayed with her before she drank it. You told yourself it was mercy. That ruin would only destroy your parish, your reputation, your faith in your own goodness. But there's no mercy in such acts, Reverend, only fear dressed up as righteousness. He stood motionless for a long time, the words seeming to hollow the air between them. At last he sank into his chair, hands trembling slightly. I only meant to silence her. For a while. To make her ill enough to rest, to stop her letters. But it was stronger than I thought. God help me, I didn't mean— Intent is a strange thing, Miss Marple said softly. It's like tea itself. A little too much of one ingredient, and what was once comfort becomes poison. The knock at the door came then, firm, steady. Sergeant Dodd entered, his eyes widening slightly as he took in the scene. Miss Marple turned toward him, her expression calm, almost kind. I believe, Sergeant, she said quietly, that the Reverend would like to tell you where to find the missing letter and the key. It's all quite dreadful, really, but best put in order before supper. Outside, the first church bell of evening began to toll, a mournful sound that rolled over the village like a sigh. Miss Marple stood by the vicarage gate as they led the Reverend away, her face composed, her eyes distant. The world, she reflected, was rarely wicked in grand ways. Most evil, she thought, came disguised as duty, kindness, or fear. And as the mist began to rise again over the lane, she turned homeward, her thoughts as calm and precise as her knitting needles, already weaving the next quiet pattern of human folly into memory. The days that followed moved quietly, like the slow closing of a door after an unwelcome guest. The Reverend's arrest rippled through St. Mary Mead with a kind of restrained disbelief. No one said much aloud. People rarely did in such matters. But the silence carried its own weight. Curtains were drawn earlier. Church bells rang with muted restraint. And even the sparrows seemed subdued. Lydia Crane was released within a day, pale and trembling, her eyes wide with the terrible relief of someone who had been saved, but would never feel innocent again. Miss Marple went about her days with her usual composure. She attended to her garden, exchanged polite words at the grocer's, and answered inquiries with the gentlest of shrugs. Yet within her tidy sitting-room, the teacups gleamed a little more brightly, as though the world outside had grown dimmer by contrast. There was a melancholy rhythm to village life now, the kind that came after a wound no one wanted to examine. On the third evening, Sergeant Dodd called. His manner was softer than before, almost deferential. "We've got it all written up, Miss Marple," he said, hat in hand. The letter was recovered from a drawer behind the vicar's study wall. He admitted to diverting parish funds. Small amount at first, but it added up. Said he meant to repay it before anyone noticed. Poor Miss Cratchit, she only asked a question or two too many. Miss Marple nodded slowly. That was always her trouble. Too much reliability in a world that thrives on discretion. He shifted awkwardly. He'll likely be sent to prison. Hard to believe, really. Always preaching about honesty. People often preach what they fear most to lose, she said gently. I've always thought virtue in some is like a borrowed coat, worn for show but never truly owned." Dodd smiled faintly, then hesitated. "The chief says you should have been a detective yourself, Miss Marple." "Oh dear, no," she said, almost laughing. "I simply observe what others overlook. One can see quite a lot, you know, when one has the patience to listen." After he left, the night deepened around her little cottage. The village had begun to recover its chatter. Laughter floated faintly from the inn, and a dog barked somewhere near the green. But Miss Marple remained at her window, looking out across the quiet lanes. The vicarage stood dark now, its windows blank and hollow. It was curious, she thought, how evil so rarely announced itself. It crept in gently, like the fog that rolled through the hedges, soft at first, almost comforting, until one could no longer see the path home. She poured herself a final cup of tea and sat back, her knitting resting neatly on her lap. Somewhere, the post office bell tinkled faintly in the breeze, a sound that once marked the ordinary rhythm of the village. Now it rang like the faint echo of conscience, a reminder that even the smallest acts, an unopened letter, a cup shared in trust, could change the shape of lives. Miss Marple smiled faintly to herself, though her eyes remained thoughtful. "It's never really the wicked that frighten me," she murmured, half to the stillness. "It's the good who forget what kindness truly means." The clock on her mantel struck 9, steady and sure. Outside, the mist began to lift, revealing the narrow road winding toward the heart of the village, calm once more. Miss Marple folded her hands, her work done for now, her expression serene but watchful, ever ready should another whisper of wrongdoing disturb the peace of St. Mary Mead. And somewhere, in the hush of that small, unassuming village, the truth settled quietly into memory, as all truths eventually do. Yet even as the calm returned to St. Mary Mead, something faint and unsettled lingered beneath its surface. The Reverend's confession, so complete and sorrowful, had brought the village to an uneasy peace. But for Miss Marple, peace was rarely the same thing as closure. She knew that human affairs seldom resolved as neatly as they appeared. When something seemed too tidy, she always suspected a corner had been swept just a bit too clean. It was Lydia Crane who first reopened the unease. She appeared at Miss Marple's gate one afternoon, her hands clasped tightly around her handbag, eyes rimmed with a restless red of sleeplessness. "I wanted to thank you," she said faintly, "for what you did, for helping them see I didn't mean harm. But there's something else, Miss Marple, something I can't quite stop thinking about." Miss Marple gestured her inside with gentle concern. "A cup of tea first, my dear. People think better when their hands are busy with something warm." Lydia sat by the fire, watching the soft curl of steam from her cup. "The night before Miss Cratchit died," she began, "I saw someone leaving her house. I thought it was the Reverend, but now I'm not sure. It was dark, and I only saw a shadow, someone tall carrying a coat over one arm. I didn't say anything because it didn't seem important then. But now, well, if the Reverend was already home preparing his sermon, who could it have been?" Miss Marple's expression remained composed, but her knitting paused mid-stitch. "You're quite right to mention it, my dear. Sometimes the smallest detail unthreads the neatest tapestry." When Lydia left, Miss Marple sat long in silence. A tall man with a coat, perhaps someone trying not to be seen. The Reverend had indeed been home. Dr. Hayward had confirmed his visit around that same hour, asking after church accounts. That much was fact. So who else, she wondered, had business at the post office that night? The answer arrived almost of its own accord the next morning when Miss Marple stopped by the chemist's for lavender oil. Mr. Sims, the pharmacist, was speaking cheerfully to another customer. "Yes, dreadful business with the Reverend," he was saying. "Still, I suppose it'll make folks more careful about who they trust. Take young Mr. Pritchard, for instance. He came rushing in that same evening, all flustered. Said he'd lost his overcoat somewhere near the post office. I told him he oughtn't be wandering after hours, but he said he'd only stepped out for some fresh air. Miss Marple smiled politely and purchased her lavender oil, but her mind was already quietly at work. Mr. Pritchard, assistant clerk at the parish, fond of gossip and known for lingering near Miss Cratchit's counter longer than necessary. She remembered his awkward attempts at conversation, his habit of finding small excuses to deliver letters himself. A harmless flirtation, everyone had thought. But in Miss Marple's experience, harm often began exactly so, small, polite, and unnoticed. That afternoon she took her usual walk by the churchyard, where she happened, quite by chance, to meet young Mr. Pritchard himself. He greeted her nervously, his collar slightly askew, his manner quick and fidgeting. "Terrible thing, all this," he said hastily. "Shocking about the Reverend. Didn't seem the sort, did he?" "No," Miss Marple said softly, studying him. "One never does, until one looks closely." He gave a laugh that was too loud, then stopped abruptly. "I suppose it's all over now, isn't it?" Miss Marple tilted her head. "I should think so. Unless, of course, someone else had reason to visit the post office that night. Someone who, perhaps, wished to retrieve something before the Reverend could act." His face paled, his lips parted as if to speak, then shut again. I don't know what you mean." "Oh, I think you do," she said kindly. "Miss Cratchit may have discovered more than one discrepancy in those accounts. The Reverend trusted you, didn't he? You handled much of the collection money. I expect you borrowed a little now and then, meaning to repay it, just as he did. But she found the same pattern twice, and when you realized she might speak to him, you went to her that night. You meant only to plead, perhaps to persuade her, but when you saw the cup already poured—" He stepped back, his hands trembling. "You can't prove that." Miss Marple's eyes softened, filled with something that was not triumph but weary pity. "My dear boy, I have no wish to, but I think you'll find your conscience is far less forgiving than any jury." That evening, when Sergeant Dodd came knocking again, he carried a look of grim understanding. "You were right, Miss Marple. The Reverend confessed to the funds, yes, but it was Pritchard who brought the poison. He meant to frighten Miss Cratchit into silence. She took the wrong cup. By the time the Reverend arrived, she was already gone. He burned the letter to hide his own guilt, but the rest, well, it was never his to confess." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze distant, sorrow pressing at the edges of her composure. Poor Miss Cratchit. Killed not by malice, but by cowardice multiplied. It's remarkable, Sergeant, how the simplest people so often die for other people's mistakes. Outside, the lamplight spilled across the cobbles, golden and steady. The village would, in time, forget. They always did. But as Miss Marple watched the quiet world through her window once more, she thought of the unopened letters, the missing keys, the tea grown cold between two cups, and how truth, though it always comes late, never truly loses its way. And as the church bell tolled the hour, its sound folding gently into the night, Miss Marple whispered to herself, "One mustn't think evil of people, but one must always be ready for it." The fire burned low, the knitting lay folded, and St. Mary Mead, ever so fragile in its innocence, slept once again beneath the weight of its own secrets. The following morning dawned pale and still, the kind of silence that settles after a storm, fragile, uncertain, and waiting for what must come next. The papers had already begun their quiet rounds of speculation, though in St. Mary Mead, rumor moved far quicker than ink. By breakfast, every household knew that young Mr. Pritchard had been taken away in the night. Some said he had confessed outright, others that he had broken down. When shown the letter Miss Cratchit had hidden behind her till, a duplicate it turned out, written in her neat, unwavering hand, and sealed for posting the very morning she died. Miss Marple read none of these reports. She sat by her window as she always did, a neat tray beside her, the morning paper untouched. Outside, the mist hung low across the hedgerows, blurring the outlines of the cottages. The world looked softer this way, she thought. Merciful even, as if it chose to hide the sharp edges of human folly. She had not slept much. Her mind, though calm, had turned over the last few days in their quiet, inexorable pattern. The Reverend's despair, Lydia's fear, Pritchard's foolishness. It was all one tapestry, the same old story stitched in new thread. By mid-morning there came a hesitant knock. Lydia Crane stood on the step again, this time clutching a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. Her expression was gentler now, though the sorrow in her eyes had not left. "I brought this for you," she said. "It was Miss Cratchit's. The police gave it back to me. They said she'd left it in my name at the post office. Something she meant to post, perhaps, but never did." Miss Marple took it carefully. "Thank you, my dear. Won't you come in?" Lydia shook her head faintly. "No, I think I'll walk a while. The air feels different today. Lighter, somehow." Miss Marple watched her go, then turned to the parcel. The paper was worn smooth where it had been folded and refolded. Inside, she found a small notebook bound in faded blue cloth. The pages were filled with Miss Cratchit's tidy hand. Records of letters sent, parcels received, bits of village bookkeeping. But between 2 pages near the end, a slip of paper had been tucked, a simple note written in faint pencil. "If anything happens to me, tell Miss Marple. She will understand." For a long moment, Miss Marple did not move. She set the note down gently, her fingers resting on the edge of the notebook as though it were something alive. Poor Miss Cratchit, she thought, so practical, so aware of others' weaknesses, and yet so trusting in the quiet decency she believed still lingered in the world. It was a strange sort of faith, one Miss Marple understood better than most. As the day wore on, visitors came in soft procession. Mrs. Hartwell, full of whispers and condolences, Dr. Hayward, polite and tired, speaking of the Reverend's breakdown and the boy's remorse, Sergeant Dodd, returning the Reverend's Bible, which he said Miss Marple had a better right to keep than the station did. Each left her a little more alone, the village slowly closing its doors on what it could not bear to discuss. That evening, as dusk folded itself over the roofs, Miss Marple walked to the church. The gate creaked softly under her hand. The path was lined with the first fallen leaves, and the air smelled faintly of wood smoke and damp earth. Inside, the church was dim and cool, candles flickering in their holders. She moved to the front pew and sat down, her hands folded, her gaze resting on the empty pulpit. For a long while there was no sound but the faint ticking of the great clock above the nave. Then, almost imperceptibly, she began to speak, her voice low, more a murmur of reflection than prayer. "It's a strange thing, isn't it?" she said softly. "People commit sins out of fear, and others suffer for it out of trust. And somewhere in between, there's always someone who means well but doesn't think deeply enough to do right. It's never malice alone that destroys, but cowardice and the habit of pretending goodness where courage should be." Her words dissolved into the quiet stone. She rose after a moment, her back straight despite her years, and walked slowly back down the aisle. As she passed the door, the candlelight caught the edge of her face, a kind expression touched with the faint melancholy of understanding too much. Outside, the night had deepened, but the air was clear now, the stars beginning to show through the thinning clouds. She paused by the churchyard gate, looking across to where the post office stood, its windows dark once more. "Well," she murmured to herself, with a small, wistful smile, "the village will forget soon enough, but I don't suppose Miss Cratchit ever asked for remembrance, only for someone to notice." She turned toward home, her steps light on the gravel path. Behind her, the bell gave a single, low chime, the kind that seemed to close a chapter rather than mark the hour. Miss Marple did not look back. She had seen too many endings to mistake them for peace, and yet, beneath the weight of all she knew, there was a quiet comfort in the thought that goodness, though small and fragile, still endured. In teacups, in letters, and in the soft persistence of those who simply refused not to care. The mist rose again as she reached her gate, curling like breath in the lamplight. Miss Marple paused there a moment, then smiled herself and went inside, the door closing gently behind her. The next morning brought a rare stillness to St. Mary Mead, the sort of fragile calm that arrives not after resolution, but after exhaustion. The village had settled back into its familiar rhythm. Letters sorted, bread delivered, gossip reduced once more to the harmless kind. But for Miss Marple, something about that quiet did not quite sit right. She had thought the matter done. The Reverend's despair had been accounted for, young Pritchard's foolishness explained, Miss Cratchit's death properly mourned. And yet, beneath it all, she sensed a faint tremor, as though one last note in the melody had not been struck. She was pouring her morning tea when a gentle tapping came at the window. It was Dr. Hayward, looking unusually grave. "May I come in a moment, Miss Marple?" he asked, once she'd opened the door. "I'm afraid I've stumbled upon something rather odd." She led him to the sitting room, motioning for him to sit. "Odd, Doctor, is often where the truth hides." "Tell me." He set his hat aside and rubbed his hands together, uneasy. "It's about the Reverend. The constable found a second account book among his belongings, hidden behind the lining of his travel case. It doesn't match his church records at all. Some entries are older, dating back years. But that isn't the curious part. The handwriting changes halfway through. The later entries aren't his." Miss Marple's brow furrowed slightly. "Not his. Whose then?" Hayward hesitated. "That's just it. The handwriting matches Miss Cratchit's." For a long moment she said nothing. The fire cracked softly in the grate. Then, setting down her teacup, she murmured, "How very strange. She kept meticulous records, always separate from the parishes. It's unlike her to mix them." "Unless," Hayward said, "someone asked her to. Perhaps to disguise the trail, or perhaps she wasn't helping the Reverend at all, but someone else." Miss Marple looked thoughtfully toward the window, where the autumn light fell across the lace curtains. "Do you recall, Doctor, the night before she died? Lydia saw a tall man leaving the post office. Everyone assumed it must have been Pritchard. But what if it wasn't? The boy was small, slight of frame, and the Reverend, though tall, would never have risked being seen near her house again after their quarrel that morning. Someone else must have gone to her that evening, someone she trusted enough to let in." Dr. Hayward frowned. "But who?" Her eyes drifted toward him, calm and sharp all at once. "You, perhaps, would remember best who visited Miss Cratchit frequently in the last months. People tell their doctors more than they tell their priests." He looked away, his voice quiet. "She came to see me. Yes, for her heart. I prescribed her a mild tonic, nothing more. But, well, she mentioned something strange during her last visit. She said she'd been keeping certain records for safety, that if anything happened to her, it would all be clear. I assumed she meant her savings or her will. Now I'm not so sure." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on him for a heartbeat longer than comfort allowed, but her tone remained as gentle as ever. "You didn't happen to deliver that tonic personally, did you?" He blinked. "Why, yes. I dropped it by that afternoon. She wasn't at the counter, so I left it on the table by the kettle. Why do you ask?" She leaned back slightly, her voice almost a whisper. "Because the poison wasn't taken from the chemist's bottle, after all. The chemist keeps careful stock. He'd have noticed at once if more were missing. But there's one thing no one ever thinks to count. Medicines returned, unused, from a closed account. A village doctor could obtain them easily. And cyanide, when mixed in liquid form, loses its sharpness of scent almost entirely." Hayward's hand gripped the edge of the chair. "You think I—" "Good Lord, Miss Marple, that's absurd." She gave a small, rueful smile. "Absurd it is, Doctor. Have a most inconvenient habit of proving themselves true. You were her friend, were you not? She confided in you. Perhaps she mentioned the irregularities in the church funds. Perhaps she even asked your advice. But you were already too deep in the matter, perhaps not by choice, but by circumstance. You handled the Reverend's accounts when he fell ill, and when you discovered what he had done, you chose silence. It was simpler, safer, until Miss Cratchit began to ask questions." Hayward stood abruptly, his face pale. "You have no proof of this." "Proof?" she said softly. "No, but the police will have soon enough. Sergeant Dodd is very thorough when guided to the right cupboard. I imagine they'll find a bottle among your tonics, one you forgot to mark off. The handwriting in the book was hers, yes, but the instructions written beneath, the ones that change the totals, are yours. You helped her correct the figures before realizing how much she truly knew. When she refused to stay quiet, you paid her a visit under the guise of concern, and when she made tea, you simply poured a little kindness into the wrong cup." He stared at her, breathing unevenly, then sank back down, his shoulders collapsing under the weight of quiet inevitability. "I only wanted to protect the parish," he murmured. "It was all falling apart. The Reverend was desperate, the funds nearly gone. I thought just one mistake fixed, one secret buried, and then she started writing to the Treasury." Miss Marple rose gently, folding her hands before her. "You see, Doctor, that is the trouble with sins committed for noble reasons. They so quickly begin to look reasonable." When Sergeant Dodd came not long after, summoned by one of Miss Marple's discreet notes, the matter concluded without spectacle. The doctor went quietly, his head bowed, his voice low with something closer to relief than resistance. That evening, Miss Marple sat once more by her window, the twilight deepening into a cool, violet hush. The village lay peaceful again, though the peace felt heavier now, weighted by all that had come to light. She took up her knitting but did not move her hands, gazing instead at the post office across the lane. "Poor Miss Cratchit," she whispered. 3 confessions, and still no one truly saw her. People seldom do see those who stand quietly in the middle of their lives. The clock chimed the hour. Miss Marple drew her shawl around her shoulders and smiled faintly. Justice, she thought, was a peculiar thing. It never arrived with noise or pride, only with the soft precision of truth finding its way back home. Outside, the mist began to settle once more over the rooftops of St. Mary Mead, and in that hush of evening it was almost possible to believe the village might, for a little while at least, rest untroubled. The mist thickened as evening deepened, curling along the lanes and slipping beneath the hedges like a creature that knew every turn of the village. Miss Marple watched it from her window, the soft rise and fall of its movement almost hypnotic. St. Mary Mead had grown quiet again, but quiet was never quite the same as peace. The Reverend in his cell, the doctor awaiting trial, the clerk trembling in shame. All had confessed in their ways. Yet the picture still did not feel complete. Not to her. There was something too methodical about it all, too careful, as though each revelation had arrived conveniently when it was most needed. Life, Miss Marple knew, was rarely so accommodating. She sat back, her fingers resting lightly on the armrest, and allowed her thoughts to wander through the pattern of events once more. A forged account book, a poisoned cup, an unsigned letter, 3 guilty men, and one woman who had trusted each of them in turn. Miss Cratchit, who had written everything down, who had left her life organized neatly in the margins of other people's mistakes. She rose at last, lit a small lamp, and opened the blue notebook Lydia had brought her. The entries were clean and orderly, parcels, deposits, figures in tidy columns. But it was the very last page, half torn, that drew her attention. The ink there was darker, hurried, and at the bottom a faint impression of words written on a sheet that had since been removed. Miss Marple turned the page toward the light and tilted it gently. Slowly, the indentation revealed itself. A name, Haywood, and below it another, smaller, written in firmer strokes, Pritchard. Her brow furrowed. The two men she already knew were guilty, but why had she written them here at the end, as though summing up a list unfinished? She looked again, closer this time. Beneath the faint scrawl of Pritchard, just barely visible, were 3 more letters pressed faintly into the paper. H.A.R. The name stopped her, breath for a moment. There were few in the village whose names began so, and only one who had spent those last evenings near the post office, carrying baskets, fetching tea, always so helpful and unseen. Harriet Sims, the chemist's wife, a woman with a smile as polite as it was precise. Miss Marple set down the notebook slowly. "Ah," she murmured, "so that's where the thread leads." By the following morning she was already walking toward the high street. The air had turned cold again, sharp enough to sting the cheeks. The chemist's bell jingled as she entered, and Mrs. Sims turned at once from behind the counter, her hands folded over a box of tonics. "Good morning, Miss Marple. You're early. Lavender water again?" "No, my dear," said Miss Marple gently. "Just a bit of conversation, if you can spare the time. You've been quite the help to everyone lately, haven't you? Such a comfort to the doctor, I hear, with his prescriptions and stock lists." Mrs. Sims smiled, a little too quickly. "Oh, I do what I can. The poor man has been so overworked, and now with all this dreadful business, well, I hardly know what to think." Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her voice held a quiet firmness. "You think more than you say, Mrs. Sims. You always have. Miss Cratchit noted every name in her book, you know, every small act of kindness, every little favor, and on the last page yours appears, though only the beginning of it." The woman's hands tightened slightly on the box she held. "Mine? That's impossible." "Oh, I think not," said Miss Marple kindly. "You were the only one who could have supplied what the doctor needed without question. He trusted you. Everyone did. You signed out a small quantity of cyanide weeks before the chemist's ledger closed. Said it was for pest control. You didn't poison Miss Cratchit, no, but you handed the means to a man who did, and when you realized what he'd done, you helped him hide it. Burnt the bottles, cleaned the evidence, perhaps even replaced the ledger pages. And when the Reverend and young Pritchard confessed, you must have thought the story was over. Only Miss Cratchit, poor dear, had already written your name." Mrs. Sims stared at her, pale and trembling, then sank slowly onto the stool behind the counter. "He begged me," she whispered. "He said she'd ruin him, ruin the whole parish. I thought it was only to scare her, just to make her ill, and then it was too late. When I found out she'd died, he said we must protect the church's name. I burned the papers myself. God forgive me. I thought it was mercy." Miss Marple sighed softly, her face touched with sorrow rather than reproach. "Mercy is never quite what we imagine, my dear. It's a dangerous thing, mixed with fear." The bell above the door rang again, and Sergeant Dodd stepped in, cap in hand, looking from one woman to the other. Miss Marple nodded once, a small, grave signal. He understood. As they led Mrs. Sims away, the air inside the chemist's felt strangely hollow, like the pause between breaths. Miss Marple lingered a moment longer, her eyes tracing the rows of neatly labeled bottles, the careful order that hid for a while, the quiet corruption underneath. When she finally stepped outside, the mist was lifting. Sunlight touched the thatched roofs, turning their edges to gold. It was, she thought, a fitting kind of ending, not perfect, but honest. St. Mary Mead would heal, as it always did, in whispers and forgiveness and the slow fading of memory. And as she walked back toward her cottage, she smiled faintly to herself. 3 confessions and 1 truth, she murmured. Human nature never ceases to surprise. The wind stirred through the hedgerows, carrying the faint chime of the post office bell once more. Light, unburdened, and final. The end.